Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Today for me, it's January 9th. It's a Friday. For you, it's probably January 11th, Sunday, or Tuesday, January 13th, in which case anything I say is not only probably going to be obsolete, it will be completely obsolete because things are moving so fast. There's a big story in the Middle East, and there's a big story in Europe. I covered the story in Europe last week, which was the Russian cutoff of natural gas to Europe through the Ukraine due to a hassle between the Ukraine and Russia. Basically, I said that the Ukraine had lots and lots of natural gas stored up, which they did. Let's see if I can capture this and go out. I don't think that I can. There we go. And we'll get back to the Middle East afterward. So over here is Russia. The gas pipeline goes through the Ukraine, and what happened was while Germany and certain other countries had built up reserves of natural gas, it ended up immediately affecting Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and certain other countries over there. And finally, the Europeans and the Russians are now negotiating directly, which is probably good for the Ukraine. And if the Ukraine ends up forcing a deal over here, then the Russian attempt, which I think was political, to overthrow or at least make unpopular during the winter the anti-Russian, pro-Western president of the Ukraine, Yushchenko, and replace him with somebody who's also anti-Russian, who's part of the Orange Revolution. Their name is Tuvashenko, who's running against him. And I think the Russians were trying to intervene and get a settlement to their satisfaction. As I've said, this little peninsula over here, which is bigger when you make it, bring it up, is almost exclusively populated by Russians because the Russians expelled or murdered all the people that lived in it before. Most of whom were Crimean Tatars, who are descendants from the Mongols, actually. So almost all the people here are Russian. This base right here basically is the gateway to the Black Sea and then to the Mediterranean for Russia. And it was given to the Ukraine by Stalin as kind of a quirk, and I'll bet he wishes he hadn't done it. So, of course, he's dead. So when the Soviet Union fell and the UN had already accepted the Ukraine as a separate country, it was recognized as a separate country. And now for the story of the day. There's a massive war going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is an Islamic organization. I don't usually deal with the Middle East questions very much, although I did during the Israeli-Hezbollah war a couple years ago. And I could go into so much detail, it would spin your mind as far as what the background is concerned, because I usually do a lot of background. But needless to say, Hamas is dedicated to Israel's destruction. The group that's in charge of the West Bank right now, which is the Palestinian Authority under President Mahmoud Abbas, has accepted in principle two states living side by side, which is what the UN and the international community wants. Hamas has completely rejected that. And through a quirk of events, mostly mistakes, I have to admit, by the Bush administration, after the Israelis had actually pulled all their settlers out of the Gaza Strip, there were about 8,000 or 9,000 Israeli settlers there, pulled them all out and made an agreement with Russia that PA troops, Palestinian Authority troops, and European monitors would make sure that no arms got to terrorists through the Egyptian side, and thought that there would be roses and wonder and utopia about to spring open. Unfortunately, things did not work out that way. The Bush administration forced an election in Palestine between and the original. This election was early in 2006. The original ground rule was that only parties or groups that accepted a two-state solution, accepted the existence of the Palestinian Authority, would be allowed to compete. Now, Hamas rejects the Palestinian Authority because it came about based on an agreement between the PLO and Israel and Egypt and some other places. So they've rejected it from the word go. They're a radical Islamist organization that's in the under the control, really, and it's armed by Iran, the most hostile country to Israel's existence, the only actual real country, nation that calls for Israel to be pushed out of existence and wiped off the map. So naturally, there's a lot of extremism there. And what happened was Jimmy Carter and his organization monitored the election, and he insisted that Hamas be given the right to compete, and Hamas won the election. Now, one of the reasons Hamas had won the election, they actually did not get a majority of the votes, but they got a majority of the seats in the Palestinian parliament because it was, I believe, broken out by district. And the Fatah group had split in two. And because it split in two, a lot of places where there was a minority of actual votes for Hamas, Hamas still won. So they won 76 out of, I believe, 120 delegates. But I don't actually know what the total was. So the result was Hamas opened up a government and immediately unrecognized Israel, canceled all agreements with Israel in the past, and vowed to commit violence until Israel was wiped off the map. Although they did say that if there was a negotiation that was submitted for a Palestinian referendum and it passed the referendum, they would consider a 10-year truce before then going and destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. So that's basically where Hamas is at, and they've never changed. Now, what happened after that is the international community was kind of wedged in by their own policy, and that was to create three conditions, and those conditions are recognition of Israel, acceptance of previous negotiated agreements, including the agreement on the Egyptian-Gaza border. It's called the Rafah Agreement of 2005. That basically says that there would be European monitors and PA troops under the control of President Abbas that would make sure that arms didn't go across. Basically, what Hamas wants are open borders, but not just to bring in food and to export olives and flowers, but to import arms directly from Iran that would threaten Israel. So that's basically the bottom line of what has occurred. So things came to a head. There was a big boycott of all aid to the Palestinian government. The Palestinian government basically collapsed in 2007, the Hamas government. And there was a negotiation that was run basically out of Saudi Arabia, kind of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the other Sunni powers came together, and they created a joint government that was no longer under Haniyeh, who was the Hamas prime minister, that there would be Prime Minister Fayyad, who does accept Israel's right to exist. On that basis, they could go ahead and they could start giving aid to the Palestinians. So that was agreed in, I believe, 2006. I could be wrong about that, the exact date, maybe 2007. And at that time, the Egyptians were smuggling in weapons to Fatah's side, in Gaza. And the government of Hania canceled out the agreement for the joint government, declared himself the sole prime minister, even though technically government is brought together by the president of the Palestinian Authority, similar to the way it is in Israel. And the whole crisis had started when President Abbas called elections, and Hamas, which had won the elections at the beginning of 2006, refused to allow any further elections. Basically, it's a democracy. We won. There will never be another election again unless we have totalitarian control. And so there was a mini war in June 2007 between Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And basically, Hamas had been putting together a police force which was trained by Iran and had Iranian weapons. And they basically won hands down, beat the pants off of Fatah, killed about 500 Palestinians in an internecine war, threw their political enemies off of roofs, and basically acted like in a way that is not concurrent with democratic ideals. Let me put it that way. However, nobody cares. Nobody cares whether Hamas follows democratic ideals. Nobody expects them to. Everybody expects them to be totalitarian, and everybody expects them to attack Israel, but nobody expects Israel to attack in kind. So that was the situation up to then. Then comes June of 2008, and the Israelis were just really hitting Hamas hard, and Hamas agreed under the auspices of Egypt. They don't recognize Israel. Israel doesn't recognize them, so there's no negotiation between them directly. And basically what the Egyptians said is, look, you have a ceasefire in place for 6 months. If everything works out, we can talk about extending that ceasefire to the West Bank, but Israel would not agree to extending any ceasefire to the West Bank because any negotiations with the West Bank deals with the PA. The Hamas Gazans were trying to usurp that. Still claim that they were the government of the PA, although nobody else agreed with that. When they took over Gaza by force and killed 500 Fatah people, the PA basically threw out the Hamas in the West Bank and declared Fayyad the official prime minister of the PA. So now there's two governments. There's a PA government and there's a Hamas in the West Bank and a Hamas government in Gaza. So fast forward to the 19th of December. People say you should only fast forward to November. November, the Israelis, there was a truce that was negotiated by the Egyptians in June. Pretty much everybody kept to the truce, but there were constant violations. The idea of the truce was to stop shelling of these Israeli communities around here. Sderot, Netzerot, there's a couple of them that are in these little areas. People think that on the Israeli side of the Gaza Strip, there is nothing but desert. That's not true. There are small farming communities that were basically settled, and water was brought in through canals by kibbutzim, who were kind of like socialists that lived in the 1950s and 1960s. So there really is something worth trading for on the Israeli side. So what then went on? Well, the 19th of December was the end of the truce. And at the end of the truce, it was expected that Hamas, not wanting to have more trouble, would restart the truce and consequently confirm and continue consolidating their power in the Gaza Strip. In November, the Israelis found the Hamas building a tunnel under the border of Gaza and Israel, and they were going to capture an Israeli soldier. There already is one captured Israeli soldier. His name is Shalit, and they have never been able to get him released because Israel's never agreed to release thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in return for one person. So they wanted to capture another one. Israelis found the tunnel. They had a limited operation, destroyed the tunnel, and of course killed 6 Hamas militants that were in charge of the tunnel on the Palestinian side. That was supposedly the end of the breaking of the ceasefire, although it stayed in effect. But it was due to be ended on the 19th of December, and on the 18th of December, Hamas said, "We are canceling the truce. We will not talk to anybody about renewing it because we don't have complete freedom of open access. We are under siege, basically, because Egypt won't open up the Rafah border. The reason they won't open it up is because the Hamas had broken the 2005 agreement. The troops that were supposed to be on that border are controlled by the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and not by Hamas. So Hamas can't just bring in giant missiles that can go hundreds of miles and threaten Cairo as well as Jerusalem at will, which Iran would be happy to give them. So the Egyptians object to that, and Hamas was besieged. And of course, the besieged, everybody's going, oh, children are starving and blah, 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 blah. But in fact, they never could show a starving child. Now there's a giant war going on, and things are different. So on the 27th of December, Israel struck. I think Hamas didn't expect that at all. After the 19th, or the 19th to the 27th, Hamas started throwing rockets at Israel, 50, 60, 70 at a time. However, there was a slowdown for a day or two when Hamas started getting scared that Israel was going to react. And Israel basically disinformed a little bit and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to think about this operation, because they had been building a lot of troops and tanks right along that Gaza border. So the Hamas relaxed a little bit. Their people came out of hiding, and boom, the Israeli Air Force came in. They killed a couple hundred Hamas policemen, who the Hamas claims are civilians, but of course, that is the military of Hamas. And on top of that, Hamas has no right to create a police force because the PA has not approved that particular force. So that's basically a party militia. It's basically, I don't know what the equivalent would be. I'm not going to use other equivalents, but it's like a Communist Party militia force, or the Russian Border Patrol, or FSU, or something like that for Hamas. But they claim it's just a police force and it's there to keep order. Of course, they're the same guys that kept order by going into hospitals and killing Fatah guys. So here is Gaza over here. The air offensive lasted a couple days, and the president of France, nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. The president of France, Sarkozy, came in and tried to negotiate a 48-hour truce. But I think by that time the Israelis were sick of things, and they were going to go in no matter what. And then came, I believe, Saturday last week, might have been Sunday, but the ground offensive started. And basically what happened is the Israelis came in over here. Here is the area, these open areas where Israel was bombarded by these missile firings. Sderot is right about there. This is Gaza City. And then up here is Jabalia. That's a big refugee camp with another 100,000 or a couple 100,000 people. Beit Lahia is a small town over here. And right over here was a giant base, which had been an Israeli settlement that became a Hamas training base. Over here is the city of Khan Yunis, and that's the biggest city in the south, couple 100,000. This is Rafah, the border city. And this over here, this yellow line, is what they call the Philadelphia corridor. And the Rafah crossing that all this stuff started over, that Rafah agreement, that's right over here. So what happened was the Israelis, and I think everybody thought the Israelis were just going to come in over here, secure the areas that the launching was at, and then give it up and say we won. Unlike the 2006 war in Lebanon, in which case there was a Security Council Resolution 1701. The Hezbollah was declared actually an illegal militia. The Israelis went all the way up to the Litani River, 20 miles north of Israel. They cleaned out $1 billion worth of Hezbollah fortifications at that time. And there hasn't been a bit of trouble on the northern border of Israel since, even though there were 2 Katyusha rockets set off, and Hezbollah, these brave people that are calling on the Arab world to fight Israel to the death and martyr all their people, is scared to death, said, oh, no, that wasn't us. We don't want to start something, because they don't want to make the rest of the Lebanese people mad. And they agreed only to go to war with Israel if the government agreed. However, it's been very, very hard to find out where in the Gaza offensive over here. First of all, the Israelis have kept out all international reporters, no war correspondents or anything like that. Especially from hostile news organizations. There is a Al Jazeera reporter already there in Gaza, and of course he's coming up with the stories about dead babies and all this other stuff. But there's only very, very sketchy references to a battle here or a battle there as to where everything is. But we can pretty much surmise from the stories that have come out that the Israelis are here along the border of Gaza City. The neighborhood of Zaytun is right about there, and there's been street battles there. Jabalia is right over here. Beit Lahun is probably already taken because it hasn't been in the news. It's in the news the first day. It hasn't been in the news later. And this is the Jabalia refugee camp. I keep on getting that round symbol over there. Okay, I'm going to show it over here. This is Jabalia over here. And it was in Jabalia that there was this incident where there may or may not have been militants right outside the school firing mortars. One of the locals, who's probably going to be killed because he talked to a Israeli reporter, says that he actually saw these guys build sandbags and set off mortars, and the Israelis got duped. They threw in a couple missiles, I mean not missiles, but tank shells, and they ended up killing 40 people who were taking refuge in a UN school. They shouldn't do that, and they shouldn't get suckered in. So the Israelis are probably here and here. The second and third days, by Tuesday or Wednesday, there were already stories that the Israelis had cut off Gaza City and had gotten to Netzarim. Now, Netzarim is right here. And then there was another story that there were battles around Khan Yunis. So I wouldn't, one battle around this little refugee camp over here. So I would bet that if the war ended today and they said, what are the lines, yet the Israelis have taken over all this, all that, all this, and the report about the battle in Khan Yunis at the outskirts is from the east. So that would be over here, but I would not be surprised if the Israelis haven't come in down here. These were formerly Israeli settlements in here where there were a lot of greenhouses and farms and things like that. And they've blasted a strip over here along Rafah, destroyed the tunnels under to Egypt, and have ordered the removal of about 8,000 people. So I suspect this is opening up here. What do I think is going to happen? I think the Israelis are going to come around here, surround Khan Yunis, and come along the Philadelphia corridor over there, and basically isolate the rest of Gaza. And the Gazan or Hamas is going to be completely surrounded. My name's Reed Silverne. Name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride. I'm a federal worker. Proud of it.